The morning sun cast long golden shadows across McCarran International Airport as Flight 447 prepared for departure. It was a Tuesday in late October, the kind of day when the Nevada desert seemed to hold its breath before the afternoon heat arrived. The Boeing 747 gleamed on the tarmac, its massive engines ready to propel 237 passengers eastward toward New York. Ground crews completed their final checks while passengers filed through the jet bridge in that peculiar shuffle humans adopt when entering confined spaces for extended periods. They came from everywhere, businessmen clutching leather briefcases, families with excited children, elderly couples holding hands, solo travelers lost in their own thoughts. Captain Jackson Mitchell had been flying commercial routes for 23 years. He was a man of routine, precision, and an almost obsessive attention to detail that had kept his perfect safety record unblemished throughout his career. At 56, with silver threading through his dark hair, he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades responsible for hundreds of lives. He arrived at the airport 3 hours early, as he always did, running through pre-flight checks with methodical care. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Morrison, a younger man of 34 with the enthusiasm of someone still relatively new to major commercial aviation, shadowed him with the respect younger professionals reserve for seasoned veterans. "Weather's perfect all the way to New York," Morrison commented, reviewing the flight plan one more time. "Clear skies, mild turbulence expected around Nashville but nothing concerning. Should be smooth sailing." Jackson nodded, his eyes scanning the instruments before him. Everything appeared nominal. The aircraft had passed all required inspections. Fuel was optimal. The flight path was clear and well-maintained. By every measurable standard, this would be an uneventful flight, the kind captains preferred, where routine and preparation ensured safe passage from point A to point B. In seat 12C, positioned near the window in the upper deck of the 747, a woman settled into her seat with deliberate slowness. She wore a gray hoodie despite the warmth of the aircraft, her hood drawn up partially, creating a shadow across her face. She was neither young nor old, somewhere in that ambiguous territory where age becomes difficult to assess. Her skin was exceptionally pale, almost luminescent in the cabin lighting, and her hands, visible as she gripped the armrest, were delicate and precise in their movements. Everything about her suggested someone accustomed to remaining unnoticed, to existing at the periphery of other people's awareness. The flight attendant who greeted her, a woman named Patricia who had served drinks and collected trash on commercial flights for 15 years, barely registered the passenger's presence. "Welcome aboard," Patricia said with the practiced warmth of someone who has delivered the same greeting thousands of times. "Can I get you anything before takeoff? Water, juice, a soft drink?" "No, thank you," the woman replied, her voice soft and measured with no discernible accent. She did not make eye contact. Her words were economical, suggesting an unwillingness to engage beyond absolute necessity. Patricia, unfazed, continued down the aisle. She had learned long ago not to take passenger indifference personally. Some people simply preferred solitude during flights. The woman in 12C did not open a book, did not activate the entertainment screen, did not sleep. Her hands remained folded in her lap. Her eyes, when occasionally visible through the shadow of her hood, seemed to focus on something beyond the window, beyond the airport, beyond the tarmac, perhaps beyond the physical world itself. Other passengers occasionally glanced at her, but something in her absolute stillness discouraged prolonged observation. It was as though she had wrapped herself in a bubble of deliberate obscurity. As the pre-flight announcements played and the aircraft began its slow journey from the gate, no one, not the flight attendants, not the passengers, not the pilots, understood they were transporting something unprecedented. The woman in 12C had spent her entire life avoiding detection, moving through human society like a shadow learning to mimic light. She had studied humanity for 34 years, learning its customs, its language, its peculiar attachments to things like coffee and conversation. She had built a perfect facade of normalcy, though normalcy had never been her natural state. 2 hours into the flight, Captain Jackson and Lieutenant Morrison were in the relaxed state of pilots midway through an uneventful transatlantic journey. The autopilot handled the majority of the work, and their conversation had turned pleasantly mundane. Morrison was recounting an anecdote about his sister's wedding. Jackson was half listening while remaining alert to the gentle streams of data flowing through the cockpit's various systems. Both men wore the calm confidence of professionals who had performed their duties thousands of times without incident. That was when everything changed. The first indication was subtle, a barely perceptible flicker in the instrument display before Jackson's eyes. He blinked, thinking perhaps fatigue had created a momentary hallucination. But then it happened again, and this time Morrison noticed it too. "Did you see that?" Morrison asked, his voice shifting from casual to cautious. "Instrument glitch," Jackson responded, though his experienced eyes were already scanning the displays more carefully. "Probably nothing serious. Run a diagnostic." But as Morrison initiated the diagnostic sequence, more anomalies appeared. The navigation system stuttered. The radio frequency wavered, producing a brief burst of static that made both pilots instinctively lean back in their seats. Jackson's 30 years of experience screamed a warning his rational mind couldn't yet articulate. Something was terribly wrong, though the plane felt fine, flew fine, responded normally to his inputs on the control yoke. "All systems show normal," Morrison reported, confusion evident in his voice. "But the displays are definitely glitching. Should we declare an emergency?" Jackson hesitated. Declaring an emergency for instrument flickers seemed premature, potentially panic-inducing for passengers. Yet ignoring unexplained anomalies violated every safety protocol he had ever learned. He was suspended in that awful moment pilots fear, when something is clearly wrong but not yet definitively dangerous, when the decision to speak might create more problems than silence. In seat 12C, the woman's eyes finally opened completely, revealing something that was not quite human in their geometry. She gazed down at the clouds passing below the wing, and somewhere in the distance, traveling through dimensions of reality that human instruments could barely detect, something ancient and patient prepared to make contact with the world it had been watching for millennia. The Boeing 747 continued its eastward journey, carrying its precious cargo of human beings and one thing that was decidedly not human, toward a convergence point where the rules of reality itself would be tested. At Nellis Air Force Base, located approximately 40 miles northwest of Las Vegas, the operations center maintained constant vigilance over the airspace that stretched across Nevada and into Arizona. Radar screens displayed the usual constellation of commercial traffic, dots moving with predictable precision across invisible highways in the sky. Controllers monitored transponder signals, tracked flight paths, and coordinated with civilian air traffic control centers across the region. It was routine work, performed by professionals who understood that their attention to detail meant the difference between safe passage and catastrophe. It was 2:47 p.m. Pacific Standard Time when Flight 447's transponder began broadcasting erratic signals. "We're getting some anomalous readings from a civilian target," one of the junior controllers announced, pointing at a blip on the screen that was behaving strangely. The signal was intermittent, stuttering on and off the display with irregular patterns that violated the laws of electronic transmission. Flight 447, departing Vegas at 10:15 a.m. New York bound. Senior Controller Vincent Torres leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he observed the phenomenon. With 20 years of experience, Torres had witnessed countless anomalies, equipment glitches, weather-related disturbances, the occasional software error. But something about this particular signal felt different. The pattern wasn't random. It seemed almost deliberate, as though something was deliberately disrupting the aircraft's electronic systems. "Contact Flight 447 directly," Torres commanded. "Get their status report immediately." The moment radio contact was attempted, the situation escalated. Flight 447 reported instrument malfunctions, navigational system irregularities, communication interference, and a mysterious electromagnetic signature that their onboard sensors could not explain. Captain Jackson's voice, when it came through the speakers, remained professionally controlled, but experienced pilots in the operations center could detect the underlying tension. This was not a routine technical issue. Within minutes, the decision was made to scramble fighters. Protocol demanded investigation of any unexplained aircraft anomalies. 2 F-22 Raptors were readied for immediate deployment. At the flight line, Captain Marcus Ghost Reynolds was in the officers' lounge, reviewing tactical scenarios with his wingman, Lieutenant David Chen. Reynolds was 39 years old, a decorated pilot with over 2,000 flight hours and 18 successful combat deployments. His call sign, Ghost, derived from his uncanny ability to outmaneuver opponents by seeming to disappear from radar temporarily, a combination of exceptional piloting skill and an almost supernatural understanding of aircraft dynamics. Chen, younger at 28, had proven himself an excellent pilot but remained in Reynolds' considerable shadow. Their partnership had been forged through years of training and actual combat operations. They understood each other's flying styles intuitively. "Scramble order, Captain Reynolds," a junior officer announced, slightly breathless from the urgency of the moment. "Commercial aircraft experiencing system anomalies over Arizona. Full intercept protocol." The pilots moved with practiced efficiency. Within 5 minutes, both F-22s were running through their pre-flight sequences. The Raptor represented the apex of aerial combat technology, stealth capabilities, advanced avionics, supersonic speed, and weapons systems that could engage targets at ranges that would have seemed like science fiction a generation earlier. Reynolds felt the familiar grip of anticipation as the aircraft's systems came online around him. "Tower, this is Ghost Leader requesting clearance for immediate takeoff," Reynolds transmitted. "Ghost Leader, cleared for immediate departure. Vector to intercept civilian target Flight 447, currently experiencing system anomalies. Maintain standard intercept protocols. Investigate and report." The afterburners ignited with a roar that Reynolds felt in his chest, even through the padding of his ejection seat. The runway stretched before him, and within seconds he was airborne, the desert floor dropping away as his aircraft climbed at an angle that defied comfortable physics. Chen's F-22 was alongside him, the two fighters moving as a coordinated pair toward their intercept point. The flight lasted approximately 18 minutes. As Reynolds approached the coordinates where Flight 447 was supposed to be, his instruments began displaying something unprecedented. His advanced avionics suite, systems that normally functioned with absolute reliability, began exhibiting behavior that the Raptor's computer systems were incapable of processing correctly. "Ghost 2, are you seeing these readings?" Reynolds asked, his voice tight with controlled concern. "Affirmative, Ghost Leader," Chen responded. "My systems are registering multiple simultaneous anomalies, but that's impossible. We're running parallel systems with multiple redundancies. They shouldn't all fail simultaneously unless something's affecting them externally," Reynolds finished. "I'm reducing speed and altitude. Visual acquisition of target should be imminent." But as both pilots attempted to compensate for the instrument irregularities, something else began happening, something that no training scenario had ever adequately prepared them for. The aircraft's control surfaces became sluggish, responsive only after momentary delays. Flight data showed normal readings, yet the physical behavior of the aircraft contradicted what the instruments claimed. Both pilots felt it simultaneously, a sensation that was difficult to articulate even to themselves. It was not pain, not precisely, but rather an overwhelming sensation of wrongness. The electromagnetic fields surrounding their aircraft seemed to intensify, creating pressure that felt almost physical despite the impossibility of such a thing. Reynolds' hands tightened on the control stick as he fought the impulse to eject and abandon the aircraft. His training, his experience, his reputation as an exceptional pilot all screamed at him to remain rational, yet every instinct he possessed was registering alarm. "Ghost 2, maintaining vector," Reynolds transmitted, though his voice sounded less assured than it had moments earlier. The commercial aircraft became visible through the haze at altitude. To external observation, Flight 447 appeared absolutely normal. Its exterior showed no signs of damage or distress. Yet both fighter pilots could sense something emanating from that aircraft, an invisible wave of energy that seemed to press against their consciousness itself. Then both F-22's computers simultaneously locked out all weapon systems, combat targeting capabilities disabled, countermeasures offline, engine thrust limiters activated, restricting both aircraft to subsonic speeds. Everything that made the Raptor a weapons platform had been systematically, efficiently, and apparently instantaneously neutralized. Reynolds' heart rate accelerated despite his attempt at maintaining calm. This was not equipment failure. This was not electronic malfunction. This was something actively, deliberately, intelligently disabling his aircraft's systems while leaving basic flight functions operational. Someone or something aboard that commercial airliner possessed technological capability that far exceeded anything Reynolds had encountered in 3 decades of military aviation. "Ghost 2, maintain position," Reynolds commanded, his training overriding his fear. "Observe and report. Do not engage. This is beyond our tactical authority." Both pilots maintained their distance from Flight 447, watching, waiting, and experiencing something that they could not explain, would struggle to articulate, and understood instinctively would change the trajectory of their lives forever. The commercial aircraft continued eastward, oblivious to the profound mystery occurring in the skies around it, carrying its secret passenger toward an appointment with destiny that neither the pilots nor any authority on Earth had anticipated. The first indication that something catastrophic was occurring came not from the pilots, but from the passengers themselves. At 3:04 p.m., the aircraft's electrical systems began exhibiting bizarre behavior. The overhead lights flickered rhythmically, as though pulsed by some invisible heartbeat. The entertainment screens, normally displaying movies, maps, and flight information, went dark simultaneously across the entire cabin. Air circulation suddenly became erratic. Some overhead vents blasted cold air while others stopped flowing entirely, creating pockets of stagnant warmth throughout the cabin. But worse than the physical anomalies was the sensation that rolled through the aircraft like an invisible wave, a pressure that seemed to compress consciousness itself, making passengers feel as though they were drowning in air. Several people gasped involuntarily. A child near the rear of the cabin began crying. The elderly man in seat 15A clutched his chest, certain he was experiencing a heart attack, though his vital signs remained stable. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm," Captain Jackson's voice came through the speakers, professionally steady but carrying an undertone of tension that belied his words. "We're experiencing some minor technical difficulties. This is entirely normal. Our flight attendants will be with you shortly to address any concerns." His words had the opposite of the intended effect. The moment passengers heard that voice, heard that barely perceptible note of uncertainty, panic began to crystallize. People unbuckled their seatbelts despite protocol, standing and asking loudly if they should evacuate. Arguments erupted between those demanding information and flight attendants who genuinely had none to provide. A woman in the center section began hyperventilating, requiring an oxygen mask. A businessman was shouting about lawsuits and regulatory violations. Flight attendant Patricia, The same woman who had offered the silent passenger a beverage moved through the upper deck cabin trying to restore order. "Everyone, please return to your seats. The captain has assured us this is routine. We will land safely in New York." That was when she noticed seat 12C. The woman was standing, though Patricia had no recollection of seeing her stand up. One moment the seat had appeared empty. The next, the passenger in the gray hoodie was vertical, moving with a deliberate grace that seemed impossibly serene amid the chaos erupting around her. More striking than her movement was the fact that her gray hoodie had fallen away entirely, revealing a face that Patricia's mind struggled to process. The woman's features were almost human, but subtly wrong in ways that defied articulation. Her bone structure was too precise, too geometrically perfect. Her skin seemed to generate its own faint luminescence, as though some internal light source was shining through from beneath the surface. Her eyes, those were what truly commanded attention. They were large, perhaps slightly too large for human proportion, and they possessed an unearthly color that seemed to shift between silver and deep violet, depending on how the cabin's emergency lighting reflected across them. But most unsettling was the absolute calm that radiated from her. While passengers around her screamed and panicked, while the aircraft shuddered with unexplained electromagnetic disturbances, this woman stood with perfect stillness, as though she existed in a separate reality entirely. Patricia opened her mouth to ask if the passenger was all right, but the words caught in her throat. Looking directly into those extraordinary eyes created a sensation of profound disconnection from her own body. She felt her consciousness simultaneously expanding and contracting, as though her awareness was being stretched across impossible distances while being compressed into an infinitesimal point. Then, without warning or conscious decision on her part, Patricia found herself unable to move. Not paralyzed precisely, but rather frozen at a level of consciousness deeper than physical control. She could see, could hear, but her body would not respond to her intentions. Around her, the same thing was happening to every passenger whose gaze met the woman's eyes. Those who looked away remained in chaos and panic. Those who met her gaze became statues of consciousness trapped in unresponsive flesh. The woman began walking toward the front of the aircraft. Each step was deliberate, precise, purposeful. She moved through the aisle with her hands at her sides, passing rows of frozen passengers whose eyes tracked her movements despite their bodies' paralysis. She was not running, not rushing, not fleeing. She was walking toward something predetermined, as though she had always known exactly where she needed to be. In the cockpit, Captain Jackson suddenly felt it, a presence bearing down on him like an invisible weight. His hands trembled on the control stick. Lieutenant Morrison gasped, his normally steady breathing becoming rapid and shallow. Through the cockpit door, which was locked with the secondary security measures implemented post 9/11, they somehow knew that something impossible was approaching. The cockpit door opened. Jackson whirled in his seat, expecting to see a passenger in crisis, a flight attendant seeking guidance. Instead, he saw the woman with the extraordinary eyes standing in the doorway. How she had passed through a locked door without unlocking it, how she had navigated the cabin while everything around her seemed paralyzed, neither pilot could comprehend. "Return to your seat immediately," Jackson commanded, his captain's authority asserting itself even as his mind recoiled from the wrongness of her presence. "This area is restricted to flight crew only." The woman did not respond to his command. She stepped fully into the cockpit, and with that step, both pilots felt something shift in the fundamental structure of reality around them. The instruments, which had been malfunctioning, suddenly stabilized. The electromagnetic disturbances ceased. The aircraft's systems seemed to relax, as though a vast tension had been released. Her presence filled the small cockpit entirely despite her physical diminutiveness. She occupied perhaps 80 pounds of space, yet somehow commanded the entire volume of the enclosed environment. Jackson and Morrison both found themselves unable to look away from her, unable to move, unable to articulate anything beyond the raw animal recognition that something was fundamentally different about this being. 38,000 feet above Arizona, two F-22 fighters suddenly registered a massive surge in electromagnetic activity emanating from the commercial aircraft. The pressure that both pilots had been experiencing intensified exponentially, as though something in that aircraft was broadcasting a signal directly into their consciousness. "Ghost leader, my instruments are completely destabilized." Chen's voice came through Reynolds' radio, trembling with barely contained fear. "Whatever's happening down there, it's intensifying. We should." "Maintain position," Reynolds interrupted, though his own hands were shaking on the control stick. "We're about to witness something the world isn't ready for." The woman with the silver eyes opened her mouth. In seat 12C, in the cockpit, across the military frequencies, across dimensions of reality that human perception could barely grasp, everyone waited for her to speak. Time seemed to compress in the moments before the woman spoke. Captain Jackson found himself acutely aware of every detail: the hum of the aircraft's engines, the faint whisper of pressurized air circulating through the cabin, the rapid rhythm of his own heartbeat that he could feel pulsing in his ears. Lieutenant Morrison's breathing had become almost inaudible, as though the co-pilot was attempting to make himself invisible through sheer force of will. Neither man could look away from the woman's face, from those extraordinary eyes that seemed to contain depths of knowledge and experience that dwarfed anything humanity had accumulated across its entire existence. The woman's mouth opened slightly. Her lips moved with deliberate precision, forming sounds that were unmistakably English, though inflected with something that defied classification. Not quite an accent, not quite an alien phonetic structure, but something existing in the liminal space between human and incomprehensible. "Tell them I'm coming home, and the old agreements no longer hold." 17 words. A sentence so simple in its structure that a child could parse it grammatically. Yet those 17 words contained implications that cascaded outward like a nuclear explosion, propagating through dimensions of human understanding. What happened next existed simultaneously across multiple planes of reality, each one experiencing the transmission in its own way. In the cockpit, the words entered Captain Jackson's consciousness not through his ears, but through something deeper, something ancient and primal that predated language itself. The meaning landed in his mind fully formed, complete with contextual information that should have been impossible to convey in 17 words. He understood, without knowing how he understood, that home referred to something beyond Earth. He comprehended, without any training in cosmic diplomacy, that ancient treaties between human governments and extraterrestrial entities had been in place for decades, perhaps centuries. The weight of that knowledge nearly crushed him. Lieutenant Morrison made a sound, a strangled gasp that was half sob, half scream, as his consciousness processed the same cascade of meaning. Both pilots felt their grip on reality fundamentally weakened. Everything they believed about humanity's place in the universe, about the relationship between nations and military power, about the foundational structure of geopolitical authority, suddenly became obsolete information. Throughout the cabin, passengers who had been frozen in consciousness suddenly experienced the transmission. Those who had met the woman's gaze received the full weight of meaning. Those who had looked away heard only the 17 words but understood them perfectly regardless. It was as though the sentence contained redundancy at multiple levels. It could be understood by ear, by consciousness, by intuition, by intellectual processing. There was no escape from comprehension. A businessman in seat 8D who had been mentally composing a lawsuit suddenly understood that legal frameworks would require complete restructuring. A mother in seat 14B, frozen while worrying about her daughter's future, instantaneously recognized that the world her child would inherit would be utterly different from anything previous generations had imagined. For the F-22 pilots suspended in their aircraft above Arizona, the transmission arrived like a beam of coherent light cutting through clouds of ignorance. Both Reynolds and Chen received it simultaneously, though the experience was profoundly personal for each man. Reynolds found himself understanding that his entire military career, 39 years of service, 18 combat deployments, countless hours of training, had all been predicated on the assumption that human technological and military superiority was essentially unchallenged. That assumption had just been obliterated. Chen, younger and perhaps more adaptable, felt the revelation as a strange liberation. His entire worldview, which he had inherited from the previous generation, was being dissolved and reformed in real time. The frameworks that had constrained his thinking suddenly revealed themselves as arbitrary, temporary, provisional. But the most profound effect occurred at the institutional level. Nellis Air Force Base's Operations Center experienced what could only be described as a collective shock to the system. The transmission came through on frequencies that should have been impossible to access: classified military networks, secure government communications channels, encrypted diplomatic lines, intelligence community secure lines. It bypassed every security protocol, every encryption standard, every attempt at compartmentalization that human technology had developed. Control Center Supervisor Vincent Torres heard the transmission. So did every military officer in the building. So did intelligence analysts at the National Security Agency in Fort Meade, Maryland. So did military liaisons at the Pentagon. So did classified diplomatic facilities whose locations and even existence were meant to be unknown to the general public. 17 words on every secure channel simultaneously. The implications cascaded through government hierarchies with the force of a revelation. In the White House, national security advisors found themselves receiving the transmission on their secure phones. In the Kremlin, Russian military officers heard it in their operations centers. In Beijing, in London, in Paris, in Tokyo, every military installation with advanced communication systems simultaneously received the message. What rendered the moment even more extraordinary was that the transmission could not be replicated, recorded, or verified through technical analysis. Military technicians attempting to capture the signal found their equipment malfunctioning. Intelligence analysts trying to trace its origin found signal paths that led nowhere, that curved through impossible geometries. The transmission existed as pure meaning, not as electromagnetic waves, not as digital data, but as direct information insertion into human consciousness. For a few hours, humanity believed the moment was isolated, that something extraordinary had occurred in a single aircraft with limited witnesses. But as authorities began debriefing the pilots and passengers, as military officials compared notes across international channels, the terrifying realization began to crystallize. This was not a localized incident. The transmission had been broadcast to every secure military and government facility on Earth simultaneously. No human government possessed the ability to suppress the information. The secret that had been carefully maintained for decades suddenly existed in the consciousness of every military officer, every government official, every person with access to classified information worldwide. Back in the cockpit, Captain Jackson found his hands moving with independent intention, adjusting the aircraft's heading, stabilizing systems that no longer needed stabilizing. The woman with the silver eyes stood motionless, her extraordinary eyes now half closed, as though she had exhausted herself entirely with that single transmission. Above, Reynolds and Chen maintained their position relative to Flight 447, both pilots understanding without communication that they had just become witnesses to humanity's greatest moment of transformation. The veil between ignorance and knowledge had been torn away, and there would be no return to the before times. One sentence had changed everything. Flight 447, descended toward Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport with mechanical precision. Captain Jackson's hands moved across the controls with the muscle memory of thousands of landings, though his consciousness existed in a state of profound dislocation. He completed the landing checklist automatically, responding to air traffic control's instructions in the practiced monotone of a trained professional, while his mind reeled with implications that his training had never anticipated. The woman had collapsed immediately after her transmission, not unconscious precisely, but rather shifted into a state that existed somewhere between sleep and something deeper. Her extraordinary eyes had closed, and her breathing had become barely perceptible. Jackson had caught her as she fell, cradling her against his chest while attempting to process what had just occurred. She was warm, her heartbeat steady beneath her pale skin, but her consciousness seemed to have withdrawn entirely from the physical world. As the aircraft's wheels touched the runway, Jackson saw them, military vehicles approaching at speeds that defied civilian airport protocol. Black SUVs, unmarked except for their government configuration, were moving into position around the landing area. Helicopters descended from the Arizona sky, their rotors creating a thunderous percussion that made every passenger flinch despite the aircraft's insulation. By the time Flight 447 had taxied to its assigned gate, the airport was effectively sealed. Phoenix Sky Harbor's civilian operations were suspended. Emergency vehicles, military personnel, and individuals in dark suits converged on the aircraft with a coordination that suggested extensive planning. This was not improvisation. This was a protocol that had been prepared in advance, waiting for a catastrophe of precisely this magnitude. The doors opened. Men in dark suits boarded first, federal agents, Jackson assumed, though they identified themselves only through vague references to classified agencies. They moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, their demeanor suggesting they had performed this operation countless times before, but their eyes betrayed subtle shock, as though they had expected something and discovered something entirely different. The woman was taken first, her limp form transferred to a specialized medical gurney by individuals wearing hazmat-style protective equipment. She was wheeled off the aircraft with efficient urgency, her destination unknown, her condition undisclosed. Captain Jackson tried to follow, to ensure she received proper medical care, but agents intercepted him, placing firm hands on his shoulders and redirecting him toward a separate exit. "Captain Mitchell, we need you and your crew to accompany us," one agent said. Not a request, a directive delivered with absolute authority. "This aircraft and everyone aboard is now under federal jurisdiction pending debriefing." The passengers were gathered in clusters, groups of 10 to 15 individuals directed into separate vehicles by agents who provided no information about their destination or purpose. Patricia, the flight attendant, tried asking questions but was politely but firmly silenced. The businessman who had been calculating lawsuits found himself in an unmarked van with 6 other passengers, all of them confused, frightened, and increasingly aware that something far beyond typical emergency protocols was occurring. What happened next existed in legal and ethical gray areas that government agencies had been preparing for decades. At a classified facility located in the Arizona desert, a location that did not officially exist, whose coordinates were known to fewer than 200 people worldwide, the passengers and crew of Flight 447 underwent what was euphemistically referred to as cognitive debriefing. In more direct language, it was an attempt to suppress, alter, or completely erase their memories of specific events. The technology available to classified government agencies exceeded what was publicly known by generations. Pharmaceutical compounds could selectively affect memory formation without causing obvious neurological damage. Hypnotic suggestion combined with these compounds could rewrite experiential memory, replacing true recollection with constructed false memories that seemed entirely authentic to the subject. The businessman in seat 8D, when debriefed, found his memories of the woman reorganizing themselves. He could remember Flight 447, could remember boarding, could remember landing. But the woman herself, her extraordinary appearance, her otherworldly presence, her devastating transmission, those memories became increasingly vague. By the time the debriefing concluded, he could not recall her face. He remembered only vague impressions of a passenger who had remained mostly concealed in her seat throughout the flight. Patricia underwent similar treatment, though her memories proved more resistant to suppression. She could still see flashes of the woman's luminescent skin, the geometry of those impossible eyes, but they seemed dreamlike, uncertain, reconstructed rather than directly experienced. When asked to describe what she had witnessed, she found herself unable to articulate details that her consciousness could still faintly perceive. The debriefing process was not perfect. Some passengers retained fragmented memories that they could not quite explain, sudden knowledge without corresponding recollection of how they had learned it. Others experienced contradictions between what they remembered and what felt emotionally true. But in the aggregate, the operation succeeded in fragmenting the witness's testimony into versions that seemed unreliable, contradictory, and easily dismissible as collective hallucination or mass panic response. But the pilots were handled differently. Captain Jackson and Lieutenant Morrison were transported to a separate facility, a heavily fortified installation that existed in the mountain ranges north of Phoenix. Here, they were not subjected to memory suppression. Instead, they were confined. They were informed in carefully measured tones by officials with permanent expressions of bureaucratic neutrality that they had witnessed something that did not officially exist. You will not discuss what occurred during Flight 447 with anyone, they were told. Not your families, not your colleagues, not your personal physicians. The information you possess is classified at the highest levels of government. Disclosure would constitute treason under federal statute and carry penalties of life imprisonment. Jackson found himself in a windowless room with a single agent, a woman named Dr. Eleanor Hayes, who carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to managing impossible situations. "Captain, I want to be direct with you," Hayes said, sitting across from him at a simple table. "You've touched something that exists outside normal government channels. There are protocols that have been in place since 1947 for exactly this scenario. You are now part of that protocol." "The woman," Jackson asked, his voice raw from stress. "Where is she? What happens to her?" "That's classified beyond your need to know," Hayes responded, though her expression suggested genuine compassion. "But I can tell you this. She is being treated with every available resource. And more significantly, what you experience today is not isolated. It's part of a much larger pattern that becomes increasingly difficult to suppress." She slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents marked with classification levels so high that Jackson's mind struggled to process that such designations could exist. They detailed incidents spanning decades, aircraft anomalies, electromagnetic events, documented observations of unexplained phenomena, and connecting all of them was a single notation: possible visitor civilization activity. "How long have you known?" Jackson whispered. "Since 1947, Hayes replied. "And we've been maintaining the cover-up with increasing difficulty. Today's broadcast, the transmission, that reached every military and government facility on Earth. You're not in isolation, Captain. Everyone in command authority just received a message that cannot be suppressed, cannot be officially explained away, cannot be contained." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. What happened on Flight 447 wasn't the beginning of contact. It was the end of humanity's ability to maintain denial about contact. The old agreements, whatever they were, are collapsing. And Captain, you're now part of the machinery that's going to manage what comes next. Jackson understood then that his life as he had known it was permanently terminated. He was now part of something vast, secret, and inescapable, caught between two worlds, Unable to return to normal human existence, Captain Marcus Reynolds was transported via unmarked helicopter to a location that did not appear on any map. The flight took 90 minutes, though the helicopter never exceeded conventional speeds that might attract external attention. They descended into what appeared to be an ordinary Nevada desert landscape, until the ground itself seemed to shift, revealing the entrance to a facility that had been constructed with extraordinary technological sophistication and seemingly unlimited financial resources. The bunker existed 400 feet beneath the surface, a complex of laboratories, living quarters, secure communications facilities, and document repositories carved directly from solid rock. The security measures were staggering: biometric scanners, electromagnetic locks, armed personnel at every junction, and surveillance systems that tracked every individual's movement with absolute precision. Reynolds was escorted through corridors lined with classified documents and research materials. He passed rooms with windows revealing scientific equipment he could not identify, conducted by personnel in protective gear, studying something that he instinctively understood was not of terrestrial origin. He was brought to a secure conference room where a man was waiting, Dr. James Morrison, the assistant director of a classified division that officially did not exist. Morrison was 68 years old, with the bearing of someone who had spent half a century managing impossible secrets. He carried himself with the weariness of a man who understood the weight of truth that could not be shared. "Captain Reynolds, please sit," Morrison said, gesturing to a chair across from him. "I'm going to tell you things that are going to fundamentally alter your understanding of human history. I cannot overstate the magnitude of what I'm about to reveal. Your security clearance, which was just upgraded retroactively to the highest possible level, permits you access to this information. That clearance also makes you legally bound to absolute silence regarding what you're about to learn." Reynolds sat, his military training allowing him to maintain external composure despite the racing of his thoughts. Morrison opened a folder, heavy paper files rather than digital records, suggesting information too sensitive even for encrypted servers. "In 1947, Morrison began, a spacecraft crashed near Roswell, New Mexico. That part of the historical record that has leaked into public consciousness is essentially accurate. What is not public knowledge is what we learned from that crash." He presented photographs, grainy images of a spacecraft's interior, technology that seemed to violate known physics, and components that suggested engineering principles humanity was still centuries away from understanding. "The craft's occupants were alive when recovered," Morrison continued. "Not human, but capable of communicating. Through a combination of linguistic analysis and direct telepathic contact, we learned several crucial facts. First, this visitor civilization had been monitoring Earth for approximately 10,000 years. Second, they possessed technology that made our most advanced weapons systems appear as primitive as stone tools. Third, they had no hostile intent, but they also had no interest in openly revealing themselves." Morrison turned the page, revealing documents signed by presidents whose names were etched in history books. "Over the subsequent decades, we negotiated treaties. The visitor civilization agreed to remain hidden, to conduct their observations covertly, and to permit Earth's development to proceed naturally. In exchange, we agreed to suppress all evidence of their existence and maintain absolute secrecy regarding contact. The treaties lasted 77 years, Morrison said, his voice dropping. They were holding. Contact was minimal. Observations were conducted from orbital positions. No interference with human affairs beyond the most critical circumstances. We maintained the secret successfully through careful management of witnesses, strategic discrediting of public claims, and aggressive suppression of physical evidence. He presented a new set of documents. Then, 23 years ago, something unexpected occurred. One of their observers, a member of the visitor civilization stationed on Earth for long-term study, developed a romantic attachment to a human woman. Against all protocol, against everything established in the treaties, they had a child, a hybrid. Morrison displayed photographs of the woman from Flight 447 younger, her appearance more carefully concealed, but unmistakably the same individual. Beside her was a human woman with kind eyes and a gentle expression, a woman who had no idea her daughter was anything other than perfectly normal. Her name is Sarah Chen, half human, half visitor. She was born believing herself entirely human. Her father, her biological father, was forced to leave Earth before her birth, returning to the visitor civilization's vessels in Earth orbit. Her human mother raised her in complete ignorance of her origins, providing a normal childhood, normal education, normal everything. But as she matured, Morrison continued, her hybrid physiology began manifesting its extraordinary capabilities: telepathic sensitivity, electromagnetic field manipulation, consciousness transmission. She had no framework for understanding these abilities. She thought she was developing a psychological illness. She sought treatment from doctors who could not diagnose something that violated every known principle of human neurology. Reynolds felt something cold settling in his chest as he understood the implications. "We identified her 8 years ago," Morrison said. "Our monitoring systems detected the electromagnetic anomalies associated with her ability manifestations. We've been tracking her since, attempting to understand if her existence represented a violation of the treaties, if her very presence meant the treaties were collapsing." He opened another folder, surveillance photographs of Sarah Chen, documented over years, showing her moving through normal human life while government agencies maintained observation from impossible distances. 3 weeks ago, Sarah began exhibiting behavioral changes. Our analysts believed she was approaching some kind of crisis point, either psychological breakdown or a fundamental shift in her ability development. We were preparing intervention protocols when she purchased a ticket on Flight 447. Morrison's expression became grave. "We should have apprehended her before departure. Our protocols explicitly allowed for intervention in cases of potentially catastrophic threat exposure. But Director Patterson overruled the intervention team. He believed we could manage her within the aircraft, that we could contain whatever was about to occur. He was wrong." Morrison closed the folders. The transmission she broadcast reached every secure military and government facility on Earth simultaneously. That 17-word sentence, "Tell them I'm coming home and the old agreements no longer hold," was detected by signal analysis teams in 73 countries within minutes. We cannot suppress it. We cannot explain it away. We cannot contain it through normal channels. "Worse," Morrison continued, "the visitor civilization has not responded to any communication attempts. Orbital observation satellites detected unusual activity in the vicinity of known visitor civilization vessels. They're mobilizing. Captain, I believe they're preparing to either retrieve Sarah or initiate some form of contact protocol that the treaties explicitly forbid." Reynolds found his voice. "What does that mean for us, for humanity?" "It means," Morrison said slowly, "that everything we've built our geopolitical structure upon is about to become obsolete. Within 72 hours, every government on Earth will have verified that the transmission is authentic and that we've been hiding the greatest secret in human history. The stock markets will crash. Religions will splinter. Governments will struggle for authority. And we have absolutely no contingency protocol for managing what comes next." He stood, walking to a window that displayed the underground complex's geological layers. "You and Captain Jackson are now part of humanity's first official contact response team, whether you volunteered or not. Sarah Chen is the key to understanding what happens next, and she's currently in medical suspension in the level below us, her hybrid physiology struggling to survive the energetic backlash of her transmission." Reynolds understood then that his life had become something larger than himself, part of humanity's greatest transformation moment. The first official response came from the President of the United States, delivered in an emergency address at 11:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, barely 9 hours after the transmission. National television networks interrupted their regular programming. Citizens woke to emergency broadcast notifications. The president stood at the podium in the Oval Office, his appearance suggesting he had not slept in the preceding hours. "My fellow Americans," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "Tonight, I address you concerning information that will fundamentally alter humanity's understanding of our place in the cosmos. At approximately 3:04 p.m. Pacific Time today, a message was transmitted globally across military and government frequencies. This message originated from an individual aboard a commercial aircraft. The message, and the individual who transmitted it, represent evidence of extraterrestrial contact with Earth." The president proceeded to outline the basic facts: the treaties established in 1947, the decades-long cover-up, the hybrid nature of the individual responsible for the transmission. He did not, could not, explain the technology that had made global transmission possible. He did not, would not, address the implications of the visitor civilization's implied military mobilization. Within minutes of the president's address, other governments responded. The Russian Federation held an emergency session of the Security Council. The European Union called an extraordinary summit. The Chinese government issued a statement suggesting they had been aware of the treaties for decades. Japan, India, Brazil, South Africa, every nation with the capability to broadcast secure military communications issued statements acknowledging receipt of the transmission. The global financial markets, however, did not wait for official coordination. Stock exchanges from Tokyo to London to New York experienced unprecedented sell-offs. The Nikkei fell 12% in the first hour of trading. The DAX crashed 16%. The S&P 500 opened with catastrophic losses. Approximately $43 trillion in global market capitalization disappeared within the first 3 trading hours. Trading was suspended on multiple exchanges as circuit breakers activated in response to the unprecedented volatility. Economic analysts scrambled to articulate what was occurring. How could markets function when the foundational assumptions about humanity's place in reality had been obliterated? If extraterrestrial civilization existed and possessed technology centuries ahead of humanity, what value did human economic systems retain? Investors, in their panic, seemed to be pricing in the default value of everything simultaneously. The cryptocurrency markets experienced something closer to apocalypse. Bitcoin, which had achieved valuations in the hundreds of thousands of dollars based partially on its potential as a universal currency in the event of governmental collapse, crashed 87%. Digital currencies based on algorithmic trust suddenly seemed naive given that trust itself had been violated by government institutions. Religious institutions experienced their own version of crisis. The Pope convened an emergency council, issuing a statement that attempted to reconcile Catholic theology with extraterrestrial existence. Major Christian denominations held emergency meetings to discuss whether Jesus Christ's redemption applied to alien species. Islamic scholars debated whether the treaties violated divine law. Jewish rabbinical councils produced statements suggesting the existence of extraterrestrial life had been mathematically predictable for centuries. Buddhist and Hindu traditions, with their historical acceptance of multidimensional reality, experienced relatively less theological disruption, though their institutions still struggled with the political implications of the revelation. But more disruptive than organized religion was the collapse of human certainty itself. Across social media platforms, universities, coffee shops, and family dinner tables, humanity grappled with a simple question that had previously remained theoretical. What does it mean that we are not alone, and that we have been deliberately lied to about it? In the underground bunker beneath Nevada, Captain Reynolds and Dr. Morrison monitored the cascading responses across global communication networks. 17 minutes, Morrison said, checking his watch. That's how long it took for the first suicide spike. Emergency rooms in North America are reporting significant increases in psychiatric episodes. 3 nations have declared states of emergency. The German government just announced they are mobilizing military forces, though they haven't specified whether the mobilization is defensive or aggressive in intent. On a secure video conference, satellite imagery showed unprecedented military activity. Fighter jets were being scrambled across Europe, Asia, and North America simultaneously. Carrier task forces were being repositioned. Missile defense systems were being brought to full alert status. Humanity, in its panic, was preparing for a war that it had no capability of winning. The visitor civilization is responding, a satellite analyst reported. We're detecting 5 additional vessels moving into geosynchronous orbit. They're not following any communication protocols. They're simply positioning themselves directly above major population centers. Reynolds felt his hands becoming cold as he processed the implications. 5 additional vessels, which meant there had been others already in orbit. How many visitors had been watching Earth unseen for decades? How many nations had known and maintained the secret? In the medical facility beneath the bunker, Sarah Chen remained suspended in a medical coma. Her hybrid physiology stabilized through technology that merged human medical science with principles derived from analysis of the crashed 1947 spacecraft. Her vital signs remained stable, but her consciousness, the part of her that had broadcast the transmission, had retreated to depths of her mind that human instruments could not measure. Dr. Patricia Wang, the lead physician managing Sarah's care, reviewed her neuroimaging data with profound confusion. Her neural activity is increasing, Wang reported to Morrison, but not in patterns consistent with normal consciousness. It's as though she's communicating internally, not with herself, but with something external. The patterns are too organized, too deliberate to be random neural noise. Morrison's expression darkened. She's in contact with the visitor civilization. They're communicating with her across whatever distances they occupy. She's their liaison now, the bridge between human consciousness and whatever intelligence awaits beyond the visible universe. At the Pentagon, military strategists were gaming scenarios with decreasing confidence in human survival. What conventional weapons could harm a spacecraft with technology 7 decades ahead of humanity's most advanced systems? How could ground forces defend against an aerial opponent that could disable all electronic systems simultaneously, as demonstrated on Flight 447? The uncomfortable truth being articulated in classified briefings was that humanity had no viable military response to the visitor civilization. The treaties had held not because humanity possessed strength, but because the extraterrestrial civilization had chosen benevolence. That choice was no longer operative. In Moscow, Beijing, and Washington, simultaneously, top-level military officials were being briefed that their nuclear arsenals, which had represented the ultimate expression of human power projection, were essentially decorative in the context of actual advanced civilization. One spacecraft, according to the analysis, could disable every nuclear weapon on Earth simultaneously if it chose to do so. By midnight, 72 hours after the transmission, 600 million people were experiencing either acute anxiety disorders or clinical depression. Approximately 40,000 suicides had been reported globally. Emergency services were overwhelmed. Hospitals were filled with patients suffering from acute stress reactions that had no medical treatment. But simultaneously, another phenomenon was occurring. In universities, in research centers, in cities worldwide, scientists and philosophers were beginning to ask questions that transcended panic. What did advanced civilization look like? What could be learned from extraterrestrial contact? What lay beyond humanity's current technological understanding? The moment of greatest despair and greatest potential was arriving simultaneously. And above Earth, waiting in the vacuum of space, 5 spacecraft descended slightly lower in their orbits, their occupants observing, calculating, preparing for contact that would transform not just the political structure of human civilization, but the fundamental nature of human consciousness itself. 3 months after the transmission, the world had begun its transformation, tentative, frightened, but ultimately unavoidable. Sarah Chen opened her eyes in a medical facility that existed both underground and, somehow, connected to something far beyond Earth's boundaries. Her consciousness, which had been suspended in a state of communication with the visitor civilization, gradually reintegrated with her physical body. The process was not instantaneous. It was a careful, deliberate reconnection that took weeks to achieve stability. Captain Reynolds was present when she first regained full consciousness. He sat beside her hospital bed, tasked as her personal military liaison, though the designation seemed absurdly formal for what had become something closer to friendship. 2 individuals navigating unprecedented transformation together. "Welcome back," Reynolds said softly as Sarah's extraordinary eyes opened. "You've been asleep for 94 days. Sarah's voice, when she spoke, was altered, deeper, containing harmonics that seemed to resonate at frequencies just beyond human hearing. "I have not been sleeping. I have been learning. The visitor civilization has been teaching me, teaching humanity through me. Everything that happens next depends on whether humanity chooses understanding or fear." Dr. Morrison requested an emergency briefing within the hour. Reynolds, Sarah, and Morrison sat in a secure conference room as Sarah revealed what the visitor civilization had transmitted during her unconscious state. "They do not wish to assume control of your civilization," Sarah explained, her hybrid perspective providing insights that purely human interpretation could not achieve. "They wish for humans to evolve beyond your current limitations. The treaties were not restrictions. They were protective boundaries established while humanity matured. My transmission was not a violation of those boundaries. It was the signal that humanity had reached a threshold. You are ready to graduate from isolation into a larger community of conscious civilizations." "What do they want from us?" Morrison asked, his diplomatic instincts struggling to articulate the question adequately. "Everything," Sarah replied. "And nothing. They want your perspective, your creativity, your capacity for love, which your species expresses in ways that appear to be largely unique among conscious beings in this region of space. In exchange, they offer access to knowledge, technology, and understanding of the universe that transcends your current paradigms." The formal contact protocols, when they were eventually established, were conducted not in government buildings or military installations, but in an unprecedented location. The United Nations headquarters in New York was expanded and retrofitted with hybrid technology, equipment that merged human engineering with visitor civilization manufacturing techniques. A diplomatic corps was established, composed of representatives from every nation, all cleared to the highest security levels, all tasked with the impossible job of negotiating humanity's entry into galactic civilization. Sarah became the primary liaison, her hybrid nature allowing her to function simultaneously as human and visitor advocate. She facilitated the first truly multilateral conversation between 2 species, translating not merely language but conceptual frameworks that different intelligences use to process reality. The political responses varied by nation. Russia and China initially took aggressive stances, mobilizing military forces in patterns that suggested preparation for conflict. The United States attempted mediation. Europe cautiously engaged. India, with its historical philosophical frameworks accepting multidimensional reality, moved swiftly into cooperation protocols. But what surprised government officials was that public sentiment often transcended political boundaries. Citizens worldwide, once the initial panic subsided, demonstrated unexpected enthusiasm for contact. Scientists everywhere requested access to visitor civilization knowledge. Artists proposed collaborative projects exploring the meaning of cross-species creativity. Religious leaders from multiple traditions began interfaith dialogues that were remarkably productive, discovering that core spiritual concepts remained consistent across different intelligence types. Dr. Patricia Wong, Sarah's primary physician, documented something unexpected in her medical records. As Sarah recovered and her consciousness fully integrated with her hybrid physiology, her neural patterns were beginning to shift other humans in proximity to her, not through supernatural means, but through subtle electromagnetic fields that seemed to enhance human creativity, empathy, and cognitive flexibility. People who spent extended time near Sarah reported experiencing profound insights, shifts in perspective, and reduced anxiety disorders. Some skeptics dismissed it as placebo effect. Others recognized it as evidence of harmonizing principles that transcended current human understanding. By month 3, the first joint human visitor civilization projects were being established. A research facility in the Canadian Arctic became a collaborative space where human and extraterrestrial scientists worked together to develop technologies that would benefit both civilizations. Agricultural protocols were being redesigned based on visitor civilization techniques that increased crop yields with minimal environmental impact. Medical applications emerged that appeared to offer cures for diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia. Captain Reynolds eventually received an unprecedented offer. The visitor civilization, through Sarah's diplomatic channels, requested that he become humanity's permanent military liaison, not as a soldier prepared for conflict, but as a bridge between human military structures and whatever defense mechanisms the visitor civilization maintained. They believe, Sarah explained to Reynolds in a moment of private conversation, that you exemplify the capacity for humans to transcend fear and embrace learning. Your willingness to work with the unknown, rather than destroy it, is rare among your species. They want someone like you in a position where you can help shape how military institutions evolve in response to this transformation. Reynolds accepted, understanding that his life had permanently moved beyond conventional human existence. He had become something unprecedented, a human working directly with non-human intelligence to create frameworks for peaceful coexistence. 6 months after the transmission, Sarah stood at a window overlooking New York City. The cityscape glowed with evening lights, a human creation that had persisted through crisis and transformation. Beside her orbited a small visitor civilization vessel, no longer hidden, no longer requiring concealment. It hung in the sky like a visible reminder of everything that had changed. "My father is requesting to meet you," she said to Reynolds, who stood beside her. "In person, on an orbital platform. He wishes to understand what his human legacy has created. He's proud, Reynolds. The visitor civilization does not often experience pride in the way humans understand it, but he experiences it now." Reynolds smiled. "And your mother, how is she managing?" "She's becoming an educator," Sarah replied, "teaching humans and visitors about human history, human art, human capacity for love. She understood before either of us that this was always going to happen, that I was never meant to be hidden. I was meant to be a bridge." As the sun set over the Atlantic, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Sarah reflected on the journey that had begun in an unremarkable airplane seat. One sentence, broadcast across the world, had shattered the old paradigm entirely. But in that shattering, something unexpected had emerged, not the apocalypse that many had feared, but the birth of something genuinely new, a hybrid civilization, a collaboration between species, a future constructed not through conquest or domination, but through honest exchange and mutual growth. The woman who had spoken only once on a plane had opened a door that could never be closed. And on both sides of that threshold, humanity and visitor civilization began the slow, complex, profound work of becoming something together that neither could become alone. In the stars above and in the cities below, the new dawn continued to break.